Buddy, we're here again for Ortus Solutions ColdFusion Containers Roadshow 2017. So what is this? This is our free month-long extravaganza. We've got blog posts galore, 5 free webinars, and today is number 3. We'll be led by the Ortus team and the community. We already had Mark Drew from the community speak, so thank you for all the community members that pitch in. Topics, we'll be talking containers, and more containers. And for those of you who don't know, Docker is one of those containers, and that's the majority of our focus. All sessions will be recorded. If you see the link below, if you go to the events page on the Ortus Solutions site, you'll be able to get to the Container Roadshow 2017, and it lists all the blog posts and all the videos all in one handy location. So please visit that and catch up on any you've missed. So why are we doing a roadshow? Well, it's part of our free training initiative at Ortus University. That's one of the big things we're doing with Ortus Solutions this year is trying to get more and more training out there for free. We're trying to demystify those CFML containers for the community. Containers are a big thing for the community, and we want to make sure we can keep up with the other languages and get you guys up and running. So we want to run, code, and deploy with Docker today, and we'll be able to do that with some of these tools. Today we're going to be looking at CommandBox and CFConfig, and we've looked at ColdBox and ContentBox as well, but they're all a big part of using Docker, and you'll see how cool CFConfig is today. I'm really excited to learn more about it too. So we are professional open source. We have a Ortus University training available, so you can go to ortussolutions.com/learn and find out more about it. We have free trainings like these trainings, other road shows, and also Ortus Developer Week, which will be coming up later in the year, which is all free. But we also do offer in-person and online trainings as well. So if you choose something you'd like to learn about, we can help you with that. We offer support and mentoring plans. We can help you with architecture design, infrastructure design setup. We also do code reviews and sanity checks, as well as we do full application development. If you are not a Patreon supporter, you can go ahead and go to patreon.com/ortussolutions and sign up to basically donate to our open source projects there. A small amount per month goes a long way to help with all our documentation and other things that we do. So all the money from Patreon does go to the open source. So appreciate any support you can give us there. The schedule, like I said, we have already had the first 2. So we've already had Mark Drew and Luis speak previous weeks. Today we're going to be talking with Brad Wood about configuring your containers with CommandBox and CFConfig. Next week, Box Microservices with John Clausen. And then the last week, we'll start playing with Docker with me, Gavin Picken. So let's get on with the show.
Awesome sauceum. All right, let's see if the desktop sharing works better this time. What do you guys see?
Oh, CommandBox.
You see CommandBox? Sweet. Okay, cool. So I don't have any slides or anything. It'd probably be cooler if I did. I probably should make some because I'm going to do a CFConfig presentation at CF Summit this year. So I was thinking I wouldn't have much to share, and this would probably be over pretty quick, but then I went to run through some of this last night and took like an hour and a half, mostly because I screwed up a bunch and I had to keep fixing it. So maybe I won't have a problem filling the hour, but I will say that I'm not coming at you as a Docker expert, but as someone who's learning Docker myself. So I'll try to kind of point out things that kind of messed me up at first when I was trying to learn Docker. And also don't be surprised when I probably screw stuff up and have to try a couple times because I'm still learning stuff and it can be a little confusing, so don't worry about that. So this is all about CFConfig. Well, it's not all about CFConfig. It's about being able to deploy ColdFusion engine, Adobe ColdFusion, Lucy, onto containers like Docker without pulling your hair out. And there's sort of there's sort of a trifecta of your application is defined by the code you want to run, is defined by the server you want to install, and the configuration you want to apply on top of that server. Those 3 things kind of come together to make your development server, your staging server, your production server. And Mark did a really good job in our first webinar, kind of talking about the difference of treating your servers as pets versus treating your servers as cattle, right? Pets are unique little snowflakes, as Mark Mandel called them in one of his Docker presentations. They have names, you tuck them into bed at night, you build them carefully and slowly over the course of weeks. They live for years and years, and once they're set up, you don't touch them, right? Most of us have servers like that. Imagine right now if you formatted the hard drive in your staging server, how long would it take you to get your staging server back in an operational state, right? For some of you, that you might be thinking, oh geez, that would take weeks to get it back, right? And that's the difference between a server that's a pet that you've carefully built up to be exactly how you need it. Servers as cattle are just, you can create them on the fly. They're quick, they're easy, they're probably just numbered, not named. We need 5 more, now we have them. Get rid of 10 of them, we have too many. And in the containerized world, that's how your server deployments are. You don't carefully and painstakingly build a server, install ColdFusion with the installer, next, configure all your settings into your data sources in the web-based administrator by hand. That sort of concept doesn't exist in the Docker world. It's, here's a complete and total recipe to build my server from scratch, and every time a Docker container spins up, out of the ether comes a fully configured server that's all dynamically provisioned as far as IP addresses and host names to make sure it's all unique on the network. And you can create 1 or 5 or 50 of them, and you don't really care. And so the code aspect is fairly straightforward. I mean, you guys are used to having code and moving it around from server to server. Hopefully that's in the context of source control. The server aspect is definitely the server aspect of being able to quickly and easily say, I need a ColdFusion 11 server here, go. That's something that's been fairly new to the ColdFusion world, in that ColdFusion servers were always something that people painstakingly installed and configured through a web-based administrator. And that's been kind of revolutionized with the ability of CommandBox to say, I want to start a server in this directory, and I want it to be ColdFusion 10, 11, 2016. I want it to be Lucy 4, Lucy 5. Just go do it. And CommandBox does this little thing, and within a minute, you have a server running that's fully self-contained. And so the Ortus solution Docker images that we're showing in our webinar series are all built on top of CommandBox. The server it starts, it uses CommandBox to do that. And that's what allows you to be able to quickly and easily change the version of Lucy, or even switch from a Lucy image to a Adobe ColdFusion image without having to rebuild an entire new Docker image from scratch. I mean, you'd want to still warm it up and have your custom layer on top of it, but you don't have to start from scratch as far as ground ups to creating a Docker image with an Adobe ColdFusion installation. Because CommandBox takes care of making the server appear. So that last missing piece then is the configuration. You've been able to script ColdFusion server installs for years. Both the Adobe and the Lucy installer had, headless installs. Of course, with CommandBox, there really is no install. It's just kind of a war deployment that happens. But when it came to creating, your data sources, your mail server settings, request timeouts, if you're on Lucy, your cache connections, all those things you had to open up a web browser, log into the web-based administrator, set your password, take your mouse, drag it around, navigate through the UI. That was always the remaining pain point because you couldn't script that. You couldn't easily script, log into the administrator, create 17 data sources that connect to these databases with these passwords. And in the Docker world, we have to be able to get to a point where there's no human interaction with the creation of a server. Servers just need to be able to spring forth from a definition of how you want the server to look. And there's no time and place for someone logging into administrator and creating data sources by hand. Most of the tactics you see with any other people doing ColdFusion and Docker usually involve copying XML files around. That'll work. It's not pretty. It locks you into a specific version of whatever engine that XML file came from. You can't take the same settings and just try out Adobe ColdFusion as opposed to Lucy, because obviously the XML files are specific to the engine you're doing. So that's where CFConfig comes in. And CFConfig is, I'm trying to think of what to dump you at. Let's show you the doc URL, cfconfig.ortus.com. ortusbooks.com. If you ever want to know what a link is to our docs, you can go to ortusbooks.com. That has links to all of our Git books. And we have a redirect, a little fancy URL, just the name of the project. So coldbox.ortusbooks, testbox.ortusbooks. Just realized I don't have the chat open. Yes, John noticed my laptop is on CommandBox 3.7 because I don't use it that often and I haven't updated it. I almost updated it while Gavin was doing the intro, and I figured I would totally screw something up if I did that. So the docs for CFConfig are out here in our Git book, and these are still a work in progress. But what CFConfig is it's a module for CommandBox that allows you to manage the configuration of any ColdFusion engine. And by configuration, I mean the stuff you edit in the web-based administrator. We already have the server.json and CommandBox that lets you kind of manage the metadata about the server, the heap size, the JVM arguments, the ColdFusion engine you even want to use, the web servers, the rewrites, that's sort of like the meta information about what kind of ColdFusion engine I want installed and how I want it to work. But everything from the web-based administrator, that's where CFConfig comes into play. Data sources, mappings, mail servers, caches, request timeouts, passwords for your administrator. That's the gap that CFConfig fills. So it allows you to read the settings from a server, set the settings into a server, and transfer settings around between JSON files and multiple servers. And what CFConfig is basically a translation layer on top of all the different ColdFusion engines like Lucy, Rilo, Adobe ColdFusion, and the different versions of each of those engines. ColdFusion 9 handles data source passwords differently than ColdFusion 10 does. And CFConfig abstracts that all away from you. So here's how you get it. You open up your CommandBox installation and you type install CommandBox. I'm hitting tab for CF completion because I'm incredibly lazy. Install CommandBox-CFConfig. This will install the CFConfig module, and I'm going to do a force because I already have it installed, but I want you to see the different stuff it installs. That'll force it to reinstall. So this will install the CFConfig module in the CommandBox. So this gives you additional commands now that you can call from CommandBox. And it also adds some hooks into the interception points inside of CommandBox that will automatically fire things whenever you start and stop local servers. Now, I want to make a very clear point. CFConfig can be used to manage the ColdFusion configuration of any ColdFusion server, no matter how you've installed it, right? So if you have an existing ColdFusion 11 installation or Lucy installation that you just use the standard installer for on top of Tomcat, don't think, oh man, I can't use CFConfig as part of CommandBox. No, you don't have to start your servers with CommandBox to use CFConfig. On all the commands that I use, you just have to add an extra parameter that has the path to where the server is installed to, and then CFConfig will do its magic. Otherwise, if you want to use CFConfig on a server you've started with CommandBox, then easy peasy, mac and cheesy. It just finds it as long as you run the commands from the web root of the server, right? So all my examples today I'll be using on servers that have been started with CommandBox, just because it's the easiest way in the world to do it. But if you have a standard installation, don't worry, you can still do everything I'm showing you today. So if I list out my system packages, you can see with that command installed a little handful of things. CommandBox CFConfig, which had CFConfig services. I got some password utilities, property files, semantic versioning, right? So this is a nice little tree of things that was installed. And that gives us a namespace called CFConfig inside of CommandBox. So here's a list of all the cool little CFConfig commands you can run now that you've installed the module. And this is what we're going to build on top of to be able to take all the configuration from your servers and wrap it up in a way that you can package it with Docker really nicely. So let's create a little test app here. Make a directory and we'll call it Docker CFConfig. I can't use tab completion because I have not created it yet. And we'll change into that. And let's just throw a ColdBox app into the root of it just so we have something pretty to look at. Obviously, everything I'm showing you is not in any way specific to ColdBox. I just like to use it when I can for examples. There we go. So there's our working ColdFusion application, right? And then I'm going to go ahead and install a quick module to help handle some of the different domain names we'll probably be hitting the site with. Okay, so let's start up a server. By default, in CommandBox, I'm going to get a Lucy 4 server. Give this a few seconds to start. The Zoom screen share always hogs my CPU. Let's see, what can I talk about while that starts? All right, so we have a bunch of hooks in our CommandBox based Docker images from Ortus Solutions that allow you to automatically tie in to the different ways you can set configuration. And you can specify your entire server configuration in one big JSON file, or you can piecemeal individual settings in via environment variables, or you can actually do both. You can have a JSON file of base settings, and you can override individual settings with environment variables, which can be really handy if you want to have a different ColdFusion administrator password on your production server than you have on other servers, or if your database passwords are different, or you want to turn on trusted cache in production, right? You can layer those settings in. If you're not that familiar with using environment variables to configure your servers, get used to it. From a ColdFusion perspective, I wasn't historically used to using environment variables for anything related to my servers. It was kind of a weird notion the first time I thought about setting an environment variable, in my Windows machine or Linux server and having my ColdFusion code read it. But when it comes to the containerized world, that's kind of the modus operandi. That's how you configure stuff. You have your application, you install it. Anything that needs to be either secret, i.e. not in source control, or just different per deployment, you set as environment variables. And most of the cloud hosts have built-in helpers to let you set secrets, as they're sometimes called, from environment variables. And then your configuration files, your app, reads from those. And that's how you externalize things like passwords, a mail server that might be different between servers. So if it sounds weird to be setting environment variables on a ColdFusion server, but you're looking at Docker, get used to it, because that's what you're going to find everywhere. It's how it works. So here's my little app that I started locally. I know you're thinking, aren't we going to talk about Docker? We are, but we're going to start locally. We're going to create some settings, and then we're going to package them, and then we're going to deploy it with Docker. So we're going to do this one step at a time. So let me open up my web-based administrator. Let's see if it'll take the password test. I don't think I actually have any password requirements on here. What? I don't think I typed it right. T-E-S-T. Hey, it's hard to spell. It's funny. I bet there's a minimum password length. I've never actually tried a 4-character password. Yeah, it's funny that password worked. Okay. So the first time through, you're going to have to set up your server. You probably already have some sort of local development server, or maybe it's a CommandBox server you've put your settings into. So let's just kind of simulate a typical application. So let's say that we're going to turn on trusted cache, or inspect templates, as it's called in the Lucy realm. I always call it trusted cache just because that's what Adobe called it, so it's stuck in my head that way. Let's change a couple timeouts, right? So let's say our application timeout is going to be 2 days, and session timeout will be 1 hour and 30 minutes, right? So we're just going to kind of configure our server here. Request. Here we go. Request timeout defaults to 50 seconds. Let's say we'll make it 5 minutes because we got some longer running pages, right? Save that. And let's go ahead and create a data source. Connect to MySQL. I went and created a database last night named test, just so I could do this easily. And I created a user called test with a password of test, so I wouldn't have to think hard today. Okay, so create a data source. There we go, as many as we want. We can do other things like mail servers, caches, but I think that's enough data to prove the point of what we're doing here. So the first thing we can do is, from CFConfig, we can basically just look at our settings. So if we type CFConfig show, we're going to get a JSON representation of all the settings that are currently in my Lucy server. So if we look through here, we can see here's the data source that I created, test, right? Here's all the settings, and I support an insane amount of variables, because data sources are crazy. There's all these little checkboxes, always permissions, allowed operation, all this nonsense is in there. especially Adobe ColdFusion. There's all kinds of stuff. Even supports Oracle. They have their own weird little things in Oracle. So all that stuff is exported here into JSON. We have request timeout. Ooh, that still says 50 seconds. Did I not save that? Where was that at? Request? No, I don't think I saved that. 5 minutes. Oops, 0. Update. I may not have hit the save button. All right, it's config show again. There we go. Request timeout. Now it's set to 5 minutes. That's weird. I don't know why that didn't save before. All right, let's see. What else did I change? Here we go. 1.5 hour session timeout by default, right? I changed that. Inspect templates is set to never, so trusted cache is basically enabled. So application timeout, 2 days by default. So all the stuff that I configured from the web interface, I can get at programmatically now with the CFConfig show command. There's also some dedicated commands for well, let's just look. For caches, only on Lucy, ColdFusion mappings, data sources, and mail servers, because those are settings that are more complex. You have like an array of multiple settings. On mail servers, you only get one mail server unless you're on CF Enterprise. On Lucy, you can have any number of mail servers. That's why it falls in this category. So there's also some breakout commands like CFConfig data source list. Gives you kind of a prettier view of your data sources. What's interesting is you can also set, if you want to, all of these same configuration items from the command line. So the CFConfig CLI commands don't just give you a window to look at your config settings, but you can also modify them. So if we do CFConfig show, and I do hitting tab completion, request timeout, you can view a very specific setting, right, one at a time. And you can also do CFConfig set request timeout equals, and you can follow the same pattern. So 0 days, 0 hours, 5 minutes, and 27 seconds or something, right? So you can set settings as well. So all that we're doing is we're parsing the XML files for whatever the given engine is, and we're either reading or writing from them. But this JSON format that CFConfig exposes to you is completely generic, right? It's not specific to Adobe. It's not specific to Lucy or Rilo. It's generic format. So there are some settings in there that only exist in Adobe or only exist in Lucy. That's just the way it is. And if you import, a JSON file that has caches defined from a Lucy server into an Adobe server, they'll just be ignored because Adobe has no concept of that, right? And vice versa. But it's important for portability because we can take this JSON and we can use it on any server, and we don't have to worry about, wait, what version of Lucy did this come from? What version of Adobe did it come from? Or even what engine did it come from? I can export settings from a Lucy server and import them into a Adobe server. So quick note here, you guys may have noticed that my password showed up in plain text here. That's right. CFConfig will decrypt your mail server passwords and your data source passwords, and it will handle them in plain text. And then when you set them back into an engine, it'll re-encrypt them based on the engine you're inserted into and the version, because everybody does things different. Even Adobe versions handle the password encryption different. So CFConfig decrypts it when it reads it, re-encrypts it when it writes it. That may make you uncomfortable, and maybe it should, maybe it shouldn't. There are ways to not have the password in the configuration file, and that goes back to those environment variables, and we'll talk about those later on. So you might think, well, I don't want to commit passwords to my source control. That's fine. You don't have to. We have several ways to work around that. But just keep that in mind when you export the settings from your server. Don't just like publish that JSON file to the internet, because it's going to have everything, including your data source passwords. The one type of password that I cannot decrypt on either Lucy or Adobe ColdFusion is going to be the administrator password, and that's because those aren't encrypted, they're hashed. So that's a one-way digest. There's nothing I can do about it. Unfortunately, that means I can't transfer Lucy administrator passwords to Adobe ColdFusion and vice versa. In fact, I can't even do it between ColdFusion versions, like 11 and 2016 have different algorithms. There's no way around that. That's just the reality of a hash. What we do then is, if you want to be able to specify a password and you want it to be generic, you can do it like this. Let's do, well, I'll show you that in a second, actually. So let's actually export this now that we have this. We've been looking at this JSON content here. We can grab this into a file. So we can do CFConfig export. And this is the process you'll probably take, is you'll set up your server the way you want it, and you'll do an export into a file. So CFConfig export .cfconfig.json. The name can be whatever you want. This is just kind of a standard name. It's a convention that's looked for. Also, most web servers aren't going to serve hidden files and start with the period, so a little bit more security. So if we edit this JSON file, we can see it's the same stuff we were seeing. But now this is our portable format that we can move around between servers. So to sort of prove our point here, if I stop my server, and I just do a server forget, right? So this will like delete the server off of my hard drive, and by the server I mean the actual like Lucy installation files. So this server like doesn't exist. If I do server list, there's no servers. If I do server info, it's like, dude, there's no servers. If I do CFConfig show, it's like, dude, there's no server, right? So the only remnant of my server that's left is that JSON file full of settings I exported. So if I start a fresh server, you'll see as it comes up, we have this little text that says config transferred, right? So that's part of having the CFConfig module installed. When my server started, by convention, it looked in the web root and said, hey, is there a file called .cfconfig.json? That's kind of the special, file name. If it finds a file with that name, it just imports the settings right in. So what this means is you can blow away your server anytime you want, every day of the week. Who cares? Next time you start the server, boop, all your settings are back in. It also means your coworkers can clone a repository that has a server.json and a CFConfig JSON. They can start a server locally, and they have everything ready to go. Data sources, mail servers, request timeouts, you name it, right? As well as the typical JVM port settings and all that stuff. So your entire server code, what kind of server you want started and what kind of settings you want in the server can now be completely portable and just be something you have committed to the repository. So my server's back up, and if I go back in to the administrator, first of all, the password should still be there. Yep, it is. And we can go see what the settings I created, such as my data source. This is a fresh, brand new server, right? I've got my data source, everything's re-imported back into it. So CFConfig really allows you to kind of snapshot everything that's inside of this web-based administrator and have it automatically get stuck back in the next time you start the server. There's a few other things with the command line. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but let's see. The diff command for sure. So we can set and show individual settings. Oh, by the way, when I started the server, the command that got run in the background was simply this: CFConfig import, and then the name of the file. That's really all that happened automatically. You can always manually import settings as you want, but the command box has those listeners. Whenever a server starts, it'll commit stuff in. There's also a nice little setting, which was totally John Clausen's idea, so I can't take any credit for this. You can create a config setting in CommandBox. And you can set export on stop to true. And anytime you stop a CommandBox server, it'll export whatever the current settings are back out to the JSON file, which can actually be pretty handy. That way, if you and your coworkers all want to share the same configuration, you can start up a server, add a data source, stop the server, and then boom, you'll have new settings in your JSON file committed to the repository. Your coworkers can pull, restart their server, and now they have the same data sources, right? So you can use your source control as the mechanism for managing your settings in a generic way. So this export on stop is not enabled by default. I didn't think everybody would want it, but it's kind of a cool feature if you want to do that. Okay, the diff command. The problem is I have to have two servers to be able to do a diff. This is my testing laptop, and I'm always wiping out everything on it. What we can do, well, I just won't demo it right now. I don't want to get too far off in the weeds. For what it's worth, there's a CFConfig diff command, right? And you set two servers you want to compare settings from and to, right? And so if you have two Lucy servers or two Adobe servers or a Lucy and Adobe server, and you want to say what's the difference between these two servers, you can take the CFConfig diff command. You can point it at each one of them and say, find everything that's different, and it'll show you, here's the settings that were the same, here's the settings that were different, here's the settings only on one server, only on the other server, and give you a nice little visual thing, which can be kind of handy if your coworkers maybe created their settings manually and it's not matching. Everything CFConfig tracks, it can do a nice quick diff for you. So I won't demo it because I don't want to take the time to set that up. But it's nice to know that that diff thing is there. CFConfig transfer will also transfer settings between two servers. It's really the same as export and import. Honestly, in all three of these cases, export, import, and transfer, all you're doing is moving settings from point A to point B, where point A or B may be a JSON file or a server, doesn't really matter. So let's talk about, let's set a couple other things. Let's show some portability here. Oops, stop. I'm gonna stop my server. Let me do a server forget again. Let me type it correctly. Did you mean server forget? My favorite feature in all of CommandBox right there. Did you mean? Okay, so I wiped out my server again, but this time let's do server set app.cfengine equals Adobe. And let's also set a heap size of a gig. All right, so now I've created a server.json file that's got some extra settings in there. So now, if I start my server, instead of getting a Lucy 4 server, now I'm getting an Adobe ColdFusion 2016 server. Update 4, John should have update 5 done soon. So unfortunately, this takes a little bit longer to start. But I want to show that all those settings that I set in the Lucy administrator and exported into JSON are going to be sucked in the same manner to this Adobe ColdFusion server, just to kind of prove the portability of your settings. As soon as it finishes exploding the zip file, which is like 300 megs as opposed to Lucy 4, which is like 60 megs, then you'll see the line that says config transferred. While we wait on that, because that can be a slow train to come, let's take a quick look at Portainer. Luis talked about Portainer in his session on ContentBox. Docker has a command line interface of its own. In fact, there's about 17,000 command line interfaces, depending on if you're doing Docker Compose or one of the specific, Kubernetes or all that stuff, orchestration platforms. And the command line's cool. I have only learned maybe 7% of it. I'm slowly learning the command line. We really like Portainer. It's basically a web-based interface that allows you to do some of the most common tasks with Docker. And I think it's a little bit easier to demo just because you can kind of see visually what it's doing. Portainer we actually have running as a container on our Docker swarm, which is kind of cool. That makes it super easy to get running. And everything you can do from the Portainer interface, you can do from the command line. It's just a web-based GUI that's wrapped around it. So I'm connected over our VPN to our little Ortus HQ server. We have a Zen server sitting in Luis's upstairs that we play around on. And we have 3 virtual machines on there. 3 Ubuntu virtual machines, Swarm 1, Swarm 2, and Swarm 3. And each of those have Docker installed, and they're connected together in a Docker swarm, which is pretty cool because that means that I can take containers and I can deploy some number of them, and they'll be evenly distributed across the swarm, and you can scale them out. I might show that later. It's pretty cool. But managing Docker, I have Portainer. So Portainer has a nice little dashboard that shows you, oops, I've been logged out since last night. Shows you how many containers you have running, the different networks and images you're doing. Right now, we just have a bunch of test stuff. We've been playing around with Couchbase and ContentBox and testing all of our stuff. So I'll be using our Ortus headquarters Docker swarm to deploy this container because I don't have Docker installed locally on my laptop, and my laptop is pretty slow. I don't know how well it would handle it. So our server finally made it back up. You can see down here, it's an Adobe ColdFusion icon now. If we go into the administrator, now the password I had set in Lucy is not going to pull across because passwords don't transmit. So we have a way to set a plain text password if you'd like. If we come in and check out the settings, we'll see that here's my request timeout, 5 minutes and 27 seconds. That got pulled in. I don't think I had anything into request tuning. Memory variables, here we go, 2-day application timeout, hour and 30-minute session timeout, that imported. Caching, you can see trusted cache is enabled, that got pulled in. Our data source that I created, test, is right here, verifies. So even though I created this configuration in Lucy 4.5, I exported it to JSON and then forgot the server and said, hey, start me an Adobe server now. all my configurations back. So your configuration is no longer tightly bound to the ColdFusion engine or very specific to an XML format that only works on Lucy 4. Your configuration is now generic and portable, and you just need to point CommandBox to it, and we'll suck it in via CFConfig, and we'll put it in there. Okay, so that's just a quick demo of how that's portable. So let's take a look at how we tie this into a container. I'm going to go ahead and stop this, and I'm going to forget it. I'm going to go back to Lucy only because I was testing this last night with Adobe 2016, and it was really painful because it would take like 5 minutes. Because I'm not using warmed up Docker images like you should be doing in production. I'm just kind of faking it with a Docker image that has to download and install everything every time, which might be fine for development, but in production you'd want to warm these up. And it's a real pain to be deploying Adobe ColdFusion over and over again because it takes a while to download the 300 megs. So let's set server set. Let's set my app.cf engine back to Lucy. Actually, you know what? Let's just do server clear. It'll default to Lucy 4 anyway. There we go. So my heap size is still a gig, but I'm gonna default back to Lucy just because I don't want to wait for Adobe ColdFusion to download every time I test this. I mentioned there's a way to work around the password to make that more portable. We can set admin password, and we can set that as plain text. Oh, yeah, I'm stupid. I just forgot my server. So there's no server to set that into. But if we put admin password equals test in the JSON file as plain text, then CFConfig will pick that up. It'll hash it appropriately, and it'll set it into to Lucy and ColdFusion. So that's how you can have a portable password for your ColdFusion servers that'll import either into Lucy or Adobe ColdFusion, whereas those hashed versions that you export, you can't re-import into a different server. Okay, so here's where things get a little wonky. Like I said, I'm not using warmed up images. I'm just using our base CommandBox image, and I'm going to use a mount to mount in an external folder that'll be my web root. So this is a shared network drive that I have open right here that points to, what do you mean by headless? Do you mean the administrator? Yes, you would want to turn the administrator completely off in production. In fact, our CommandBox images have a flag. I forget the name, if it's production or what it is, or secure. We have an environment variable you can set on our CommandBox images that'll automatically block access completely to the ColdFusion or Lucy administrator. Because yeah, on a production Docker image, the administrator's dead to you. You don't ever touch the administrator. That's one of the things with Docker. You never change settings on a Docker image. You create a new Docker image and you deploy it, right? So your Docker images are always a snapshot in time. And if you want to change a ColdFusion setting, you don't log into a web-based administrator. You make a new Docker image with a new setting and you deploy it. That's how you always work. So yeah, on production, your ColdFusion administrator, Lucy administrator is dead. It's gone. Doesn't exist, right? Okay, so this is basically a shared network drive that we have as part of our Ortus HQ, and this is mapped as an NFS share onto all of our swarm nodes. And so I'm going to use this as a convenient shared file system to be able to easily share files with all of my containers. So I'm going to create a folder called Docker CFConfig. It'd be fun to see if I get all these names right the first time. And, oh, I don't have this open. Let's open up, this is my local application, right? I've got my server.json, I got my config.json, and for a quick and dirty example, we're just going to dump this into a shared, this shared network location. And I'm going to use the base CommandBox image, and I'm just going to point to it and say that's where your web root is, and we'll pick it up. So in Portainer, the difference between adding, well, this isn't a Portainer thing, this is just in Docker Swarm. The difference between adding a container and a service is when you can create a container, you're deploying a single instance of a Docker image onto a single Docker host, right? That's just the simple deployment method. A service is when you say, here's a Docker image and I want to have some number of these images spread across some number of swarm nodes, which I may scale up or down at my whim, and I want any incoming traffic to just be automatically load balanced across them, right? Kind of like what you do with a load balancer now, just way easier, and you can change it on the fly. Who cares? And I'll show you how, right? So I'm going to add a service. Let's see if I can figure this out because I kept screwing it up last night. So I'm just going to call it a Docker CFConfig. The name's really arbitrary. This is the name of the image, and I'm going to just point it directly to our Ortus Solutions CommandBox image. Let's see if I type that right. On production, you would create your own layer on top of this. You would compile that would have your server started, warmed up, ready to go. But this is just kind of for demo purposes. And then I'm going to map a port. Ooh, you know what? That's a good point. I didn't set my port. I need to know what the port's going to be, or I'm going to have problems with this. Let's do server set web.http.port, and let's say 8080 is the port that'll be inside my container, right? And all that did is it added my port here into my server.json. And then let me recopy that server.json over here to the shared network drive so it can be picked up. Okay, so inside the container, ColdFusion Lucy is going to be starting on port 80. And we need to map that through. By default, the host machine doesn't have any ports mapped through into your container, right? So the container just kind of runs in a little black box, and you have to explicitly tell Docker, I want this port inside my container to be available on this port externally. I'm pretty certain we're probably using port 8080 for something on our swarm, so I'm going to do 8037 because that's how old I am. Not 8037, just 37. So externally, outside the swarm, we'll hit port 8037, and that'll map through to a container who's running internally on port 8080. And that's all I'm going to create for now. We'll go back in and we'll add that mapping. Okay, so here's my service, Docker CFConfig. We need to tell it where the code is. And we'll see how many times I type this without screwing it up. So we're going to add a mount. And let's see, source should be ops shared data. This is the part where I go and I copy off my clipboard. Silly Windows backslashes. Okay, so my Docker Swarm host machines will have access to this folder because it's just a shared network file storage. And internally, I want that to be represented as /app. And that's how our CommandBox Docker images are set up, is your web root is /app. So you want to map whatever code into that web root to get picked up. Okay, we'll add that. And I also need to set some environment variables. The .cfconfig.json file is supposed to be picked up by default. However, there's a bug in my code that I fixed last night, but it's not part of our image yet, and it doesn't get picked up. So that's no problem. I'll just set an environment variable. I'm pausing because I'm trying to remember what the heck the name of the environment variable was, and I've completely forgot. So what we're going to do is we're going to go, actually, I think I have it open on my other computer real quick. What's the environment variable? CFConfig file, that's what it was. I don't think I've made this into the docs yet because this is fairly new functionality. Okay, so CFConfig file, and it's going to be /app/, right, because that's where I have it sitting right now. So when the server, come on, you got to type it right, it just isn't going to work. There we go. So when the server starts up, I'm telling the CFConfig, which is looking for this environment variable, hey, there's a JSON file I want you to load, and this is where it's located, right? So that environment variable will get picked up. Let's stop right there and let's see if this thing's actually running. So what's interesting is every time I went in and I made a change and I hit save, it actually killed the previous Docker container that had been starting up and started a new one. It's how Pertainer and Docker works. So anytime you go in and you make a change, it just automatically redeploys without you having to do anything. So if we scroll down here in Pertainer to the bottom, you can actually see a list of all the things that's done in the past. So you can see previously shut down containers, because every time I made a setting, it would just kill the old one, start a new one. That's the thing. Docker containers can die at any instant, right? You can never assume that a Docker container will be alive 2 seconds from now. They can just be killed and restarted. That's why things like log files, user uploads, those always have to go to shared file storage, S3, stuff like that, because Docker containers are completely temporary. So you can see we have a running Docker container. It's on the 3rd node in our swarm. And with Portainer, I can go to my 3rd swarm node, click on containers, and here we go. So here's a healthy Docker config container. You can see some previous stopped ones that are still there. Portainer is kind of nice because we can go in, we can get some quick stats on the containers. Of course, there's 0 traffic, so the stats are kind of boring right now. We can view the logs from the container, which is the reason I came here. So this is the console output as the container came up. You can see recognize Lucy4, she was from port 8080, blah, blah, blah. Here it is downloading stuff to be used. And you can see all the output as the server actually started. So these logs are really handy. Basically, what you would get in CommandBox if you did a server log -- follow or a server start -- console, that's essentially what you get in the logs. We just stream the log output right here. Another really cool thing, you wouldn't do this in production per se, but just for debugging, from Portainer, you can open up a web-based console, which is the same as SSHing right into it. So I can actually come in and I can use the bash shell that's inside of my running container to maybe poke at log files or figure out why something didn't work very well. So that's kind of nice to know. Of course, like I said, all this can be done from the command line, but this is how the Portainer interface does it. Okay, well, actually, there's one thing I wanted to look for in that log file. I wanted to see if it picked up my settings. I want to see that config transferred line. Actually, I don't see it. I wonder if I typed it wrong. Let's go back to Swarm1 master services. Let's edit my Docker config service. And let's look at my environment variables. What? There are no environment variables for the service. I don't know what I did, but I did not save my environment variable somehow. CFConfig file. That would explain why I didn't pick it up. I had this problem last night a couple times where I swore I saved something and then I went back and it was just gone. I don't know if that's me doing stupid stuff or if that's Portainer being a little flaky. All right, let's try again. All right, so automatically when I save that, it will kill, right? You can see it's already preparing a new one. Starting the process of shutting my old one down. There's also some cool settings in here. Restart condition. You can tell Docker to automatically restart any containers that go bad. You may be thinking, how does Docker, I shouldn't say Portainer, because Portainer is just wrapping the Docker features. How does Docker know when the container is healthy or not, right? We have a built-in health check URL, which you can customize if you like. And basically, it keeps hitting the home page until it gets back a successful 200 response. So until then, it won't put a container into your cluster and starts feeding it traffic until it's healthy. So until that URL comes back and says, okay, I'm getting a 200 HTTP response, it's not going to be considered healthy. And furthermore, if the app stops responding in the future and that URL stops, ColdFusion locks up, crashes, hangs, for whatever reason, Docker will automatically say, man, this node is no longer healthy. The health check URL is failing, and you can have it automatically just restart any unhealthy nodes. Just kill them, spin them up again, right? Happens automatically. There's also parallelism. This is actually pretty cool. If you have 10 containers running across your swarm and you push an update, a new version of the image, a new environment variable, a new setting, anything that needs to do it, it doesn't kill all 10 of them, right? And have your site go down in the meantime. It kills off one by default. This is our parallelism, right? It kills off one server. I think it brings the new server up once it's healthy, kills off one, puts the new one in. And it does that in like a rolling update. So over the course of the next, 5 minutes, probably not even 5 minutes, probably, in the course of the next 2 minutes, if you have warmed up Docker containers, it's slowly swapped out all your running containers to all be new. But your users never know anything. Your site never goes offline. You still have at least 9 other containers running at all points in time. So the way that the swarm stuff handles these rolling updates is actually really, really nice. That's the kind of stuff that people wish they could do with their load balancer, but it would be like a total pain, right? Okay, so meanwhile, I talked long enough that it is probably redeployed. Let's hit refresh on this page. go back and look, and where are my servers? There we go. It was just taking a second to load. I'm impatient. All right, so new containers running on Swarm 3. If we go back and look at Swarm 3, let's go take a look. Here's my healthy Docker container. Let's check out the logs. We should see that little CFConfig. There we go, config transferred, boom. So that tells me my container came up. It found that environment variable. It sucked in the JSON settings. All my settings should be there. So we've done everything at this point, but actually look at this stupid running container, right? So let's actually do that. There's actually a nice little link right here, Docker config. I can just click on this link in Portainer. It'll pop it open in a new tab. So here's the ColdBox site that we created, running in a single container on our Swarm. Now I have not enabled the production setting, so we'll still be able to hit the administrators because they're not locked down unless you dial in that production setting. Oh crap! I'm trying to think what password this is. I think it's this one. There we go. So if we look here, this is the website running on Docker now. We can look at my data sources, if we can see all of our settings have followed us. The JSON file has been picked up. It's imported the settings. I've got my data sources. I've got my request timeouts of 327 seconds, right? So now we can spin up our Docker containers. We can point at the JSON file. We can say, load the sucker in. So let's talk about the environment variables and the way I told you guys you can override things like database passwords and things like that. So first of all, in our service, I only have a single environment variable right now. Come on, sorry, my laptop is a little slow. There we go. So I only have a single environment variable, and it's the environment variable that says, hey, CFConfig, here's a JSON file. If you can get a minute, can you load it in for me, right? What we can also do is we can create ad hoc CFConfig, ad hoc environment variables that named by convention will be automatically picked up by CFConfig and layered in on top of any JSON file. So if you create any environment variable called CFConfig underscore and follow it by whatever the name of the thing is you want to set, like admin password, which is the name of a thing you can set in CFConfig. And by the name of a thing you can set, I mean anything you can do CFConfig show, right? Like everything that shows here, there's a crap ton of stuff. You can do CFConfig underscore any of these, right? So CFConfig underscore admin password, I like spam, right? So the next time this container starts, the administrator password is going to be set to I like spam. And these ad hoc variables will take precedence over your JSON file. So you can have a JSON file with maybe some default development stuff, and then you can layer on individual environment variables to turn on trusted cache only in production, to swap out your data, your administrator password, maybe lower your request timeout, stuff like that, right? So you can layer in as many of these as you want. Oh, I didn't mean to hit save. I'm an idiot. There we go. You can layer in as many of these as you want. So we can even do like CFConfig underscore request timeout, right? And it'd be the same format as before. So 0 days, 0 hours, 10 minutes, and 0 seconds, right? So that'll override whatever's set in my JSON file. And you can have as many of these environment variables as you want, and they're just going to get automatically picked up. This is super handy. For real quick, easy configuration. And all of this stuff is not part of source control. It's not part of a JSON file. It's not committed to your repository. It can be different for production, different for staging. And also, if you have, a public website, not public website, an open source website where the code for your website is committed to some public GitHub repository, and you want to have secrets that, people can't just see, this is where the environment variables come into play. So let's give this a second while it redeploys. When you warm up your images, John Clausen has a really good blog post on this. You want to compile your own images, and as part of the compilation, see, Luis is making fun of me. I'm already hit an hour. You actually start up the server, import the configuration, get it fully warmed up, generate all the class files, and shut down and save in that state. When you've done that, your Docker containers will spin up in like seconds. We're talking like, give me a container, 10 seconds later, it's in the Swarm processing request. And that's what you want. You want these containers to spin up super duper fast. In our instance, the containers are taking about a minute to come up because these are not warmed up containers. This is only what you want to do in like development, right? So let's see, we've pulled up our site. So let's see, the password should now be I like spam. Why did I choose such an annoying password to type? Yep, so my password, it picked up my environment variable, the password was changed, and if we go look at request, there we go, the request timeout is now 10 minutes, and I layered that in with an environment variable on top of my JSON. So that's the first way that we can override things with environment variables. Now, this works easy for simple settings that are just a string, right? Anything like, so password, request timeout, any simple settings are pretty straightforward. You know, create an environment variable, give it a value, bada bing, bada boom. So what about data sources, right? You can't, a data source is like a complex struct of all sorts of keys, and you can't really specify a data source just as a single environment variable easily. And you can't override just the password key of the data source with the environment variable. So what we do is we fall back on system settings, as they're called, which is something that we added in CommandBox 3.7, I believe. How would you enable Fusion Reactor to register? For example, if you have 3 instances of the app running in Docker, you can see all 3 instances from a global rollup perspective. Are you talking about like the Fusion Reactor manager? Well, here, the short answer to your question is I don't know off the top of my head, but I know you can do it. Fusion Reactor in recent versions added a whole bunch of JVM arguments, and the Fusion Reactor CommandBox module, which you can make be part of your images, supports all of those as settings, and so you can specify. They have ways to specify your license, all sorts of stuff. But I don't know the answer right off, but I'm sure it's possible. Okay, so system settings. So in CommandBox, you have the ability to reference environment variables or system properties from inside a CommandBox. Oh, I'm stupid. That is not a command. I want to echo out path. Right, so this is an example of me using the CommandBox echo command to reference an environment variable that I have set in Windows. Right, so CommandBox now natively speaks environment variables, and that's good because we can now piggyback on top of that, and CFConfig by proxy also speaks environment variables. So the placeholder looks like this, $, curlies, and the name of the environment variable you want to reference. If you're wondering if you reference a non-existent environment variable, dang it, I'm so stupid. I left off the echo. If I echo out a non-existent environment variable, there's no errors, it's just an empty string, and that's pretty much how Windows and Unix handles environment variables. There's one extra little trick to this. You can do colon and then a default value. So if the environment variable doesn't exist, CommandBox will just use the default value. So now, how do we use this? Let's edit our, come on, CFconfig.json file. And we don't want to have this password in here, right? This totally weirds us out having passwords in here. So here's the password test. So what we do is we say, go grab an environment variable that I'll set up, and let's call it db_pass, right? So what happens is when CFconfig reads in this JSON file, it will go and it will look for an environment setting called, an environment variable called db_pass, or a JVM system property as well. And it'll substitute that as the actual value. So now in Portainer, we come in, add an environment variable, db_pass, spelled correctly, and the password was test, right? So now I can deploy my JSON file with all those secrets. I mean, and it doesn't have to be passwords. It can be, you know, Amazon S3 keys. It can be, you know, any sort of licenses, anything that you want to have be either different from one server to the next, or just a secret that you're not cool with having, you know, in the JSON file. You can put placeholders in. And we can do the same thing with our server.json, right? So if I come in and I edit my server.json file, this port here, port 8080, maybe I want to have the port be different on one server than the next, right? So I can say, let's create an environment variable called HTTP port. This is kind of a bad example because our Ortus solution Docker images actually have some environment variables built in for port. But just to show it, I can say, go look for an environment variable of this name, and if you don't find one, default back to 8080. right? So we can use these environment variable placeholders in either our CFConfig JSON or our server.json, and they'll all be replaced. And then just to bring closure to this example, I would then go and I would say, give me an environment variable. Come on. Oh, numlock got turned off. And make that environment variable set to 8080 or whatever I want. So being able to swap out the placeholders in your JSON files is really nice. So there's really kind of multiple ways you can do things, but between a JSON file that's just one big chunk of configuration, individual CFConfig overrides that layer on top of the JSON file, and look at that, it didn't save. I'm telling you, Pertainer's out to make me insane. Look at that. I hit apply changes and it did not save. I have a theory that if my cursor is still in the text box, it doesn't save or something weird like that. I don't know what's up with that. So between the JSON file, the individual parameters, and the environment variable replacements inside of a JSON files, you basically have a whole lot of ways you can figure out something that works for you and your workflow to be able to configure your stuff and deal with it. So, you know, how you set it up is really up to you. The easiest thing is to do what I did today. Spin up your CommandBox server, or whatever your server is, doesn't have to be CommandBox. Create your settings one time through the interface, do a CFConfig export to get them into JSON, and then tie in the appropriate environment variables to let CommandBox know what it is you want to load, layer on your overrides on top of that however you see fit. And now you really have a true separation of the server you want to run your code on, the code you want to run on the server, and the configuration you apply to the server, and it's all completely scriptable. It's completely generic. It's not, you know, tied to ColdFusion 11 or something like that. And another thing, I was talking about how you don't use the administrator. When an Adobe ColdFusion releases an update or Lucy comes out with a new version, you don't go into the administrator and run the automatic updater. No, you update the image to be the latest version, and then you just let Docker deploy a new container, right? Containers never change. They're snapshots in time. If you want anything to be different about it, you just change it. But it's super easy. Upgrading a pet server is always a pain. You got to like back up the server. You're trying to upgrade it in place. You're hoping you don't screw stuff up. With Docker, the server is rebuilt and reconfigured every time you deploy the container, or every time you build the container, I should say. So there's none of this nonsense of how do I upgrade my Docker container. You don't. You just make a new Docker container and you bump the version number and it deploys to the new version. There's no such thing as these long-lived ColdFusion servers that are around for years that would take you weeks to rebuild. Everything is completely scripted. And while we're in here with Portainer, I wanted to show the fun scaling. I've been just using a single replica. If I want, I can say, come on, you know, give me 6. So I have a service, I want to scale up and have 6 replicas. So what that means is I want to have 6 servers. I want to have 6 Docker containers deployed out there in the ether. So what happens automatically when I hit the apply, did it save? It says 1 still. Look at this. All right, I'm okay, watch. If I leave the cursor in the box and hit apply, I swear this is a bug in Portainer. Or no, did it work this time? I'm going crazy, guys. I don't know why. Portainer doesn't always save my stuff. Maybe he just doesn't like me. Okay, so check it out. We have 1 running container, which is the run running before. Now we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 additional containers are starting up as we speak. They're just being spun up, and they're being evenly distributed across those 3 swarm nodes that we have. So I've got 2 on swarm 3, 2 on swarm 2, and 2 on swarm 1. So if we give these suckers a second to start, it's important to note that my site never goes down, right? This entire time that I'm spinning up servers, my site's still accessible, and as the servers come online and the health check passes, they're just going to be dropped into the swarm, and the internal mesh network that Swarm does will automatically just start serving traffic out to the new nodes as they come in. So after a second, I don't know if I have to refresh this page for it to show or not. But after a few seconds, there we go. So now these are all running. So now I have on Docker Swarm 6 instances of my container, all running with the same code, the same engine, the same configuration built on the fly. And the website just keeps working. Nobody ever notices the difference, right? And if I go back up and say, you know what, 6 is too many. That was crazy talk. Whoa, not 0. Easy there. I only want to have 3 nodes. I can just scale that down at any time, and it's just going to go and it's just going to kill off 3 of the containers. They're just going to disappear. So if we come down here, look, boom, that was instant. 3 of them are now missing. I'm down to 3 running containers, and oh look, the website never went offline. There it is. So obviously this brings some interesting things you have to think about with the swarm deployments. If you come up with a new version of your ColdFusion code, which by the way, how do you get ColdFusion changes to a Docker container? Do you FTP it into it? No, you create a new image, right? Everything about the container, including the code, when you do a code release, it's just a new container with the new code inside of it. So if you make a code change that references a new database column, right, you have to make sure that database column is in place before you start rolling out swarm updates, because there can be a minute, of time in which half of the containers in the swarm are on the old version of the code, waiting in line to be rolled over. Half the containers in the swarm have the new code. So, you can do offline installs with Docker if you want to be all 1998 about it. But if you really want to embrace this cool swarm stuff, you have to think about the changes you're doing so it can be rolled out automatically without breaking stuff. And when you kind of do the extra legwork to make that happen, never drop a database column, always, rename it and roll out the new code and then drop it later. As long as you're willing to work around those sort of things, then there's a lot of power in this swarm stuff, which really has nothing to do with CFConfig, but I just really love it, so I wanted to mention it. That's basically all I had to cover today. What if your update is a breaking change? Well, the answer to that is don't make a breaking change. Like I said, there's ways to do everything, but sometimes it involves multiple steps. So if you want to rename a database column, right, you create a new database column, you copy the old data into it, you change your code to reference the new column, you roll out the change reference to the new column. Then you roll out a change that deletes the old database column. Yeah, it's more work. Totally. But if it's important for your business and your company and your website that you need to have 100% uptime, and you want to be able to just have a swarm out there and just roll out changes and keep everything live and never have to take your website offline for 4 hours to do a code update, if your company wants that kind of uptime, then those are the things you have to live with. You have to never make breaking changes. Some people don't care. You have a small website, you're like, who cares if it goes offline for 2 hours? In that case, all right, do whatever you want. But Docker gives you the ability to very easily never have to take your website offline because of how easily you can have a swarm with multiple containers. But anyway, that's sort of off topic for CFConfig. But what do we have in the way of questions? I didn't show every nook and cranny of CFConfig because then it might have been a 5-hour presentation. But is there anything that you guys want to ask me, or you want me to show something that I may have skimmed over about exactly how CFConfig worked? If so, ask now or forever hold your peace. What's interesting here, I should do it just for the heck of it. What's interesting is if I take server set app.cfengine, what if I put this back to Adobe, right? Server show. So I just completely changed the entire ColdFusion engine in use from Lucy to Adobe, right? If I copy this file over to the shared folder and replace it, and then I'll go trigger a build in Portainer by just changing something. Easiest way to trigger it. What's actually interesting to think about is the fact that as Docker's swarm kills off my containers one at a time and brings them back up, it's going to be killing off Lucy containers and bringing up Adobe ColdFusion containers. So at some point in time, my site will be running on 1 Lucy server and 2 Adobe servers, or 2 Lucy servers and 1 Adobe server. What's cool about that is we don't really care, right? It's just an implementation detail. We have code, we have engine, we have configuration, and a Docker assembles in the back end. And that's pretty cool, I think. Pretty cool. So right here, you can see it's already going through changing them over. Okay, can we build tasks to do Docker complex commands inside of CommandBox? I don't know what you mean, but I'm sure the answer is probably yes. This may be more of a CommandBox question, but how does this handle Adobe CF license versions? I don't know what you mean by license versions, but it handles licenses like this. CFConfig set license equals whatever the heck your Adobe license key is. Well, sorry, I don't have a server. I forgot my server, so I have no server to set that into. But you just put your Adobe ColdFusion license right there in the JSON file, or an environment variable, and it sucks it in and it feeds it into Adobe ColdFusion. So you can do this on production with Adobe ColdFusion. We have customers doing this right now, and the license is not a problem. It's just part of what CFConfig handles. Does that answer your question, Michael? Okay. Yeah, I mean, our goal is to be able to script everything you can do in the interface. CFConfig is not 100%, just because there's a lot of settings out there and there's a lot of engines. If you find something CFConfig doesn't do, let me know. I mean, we'll try to work on it. There's some things that I've added to CFConfig, like support for support for Oracle data sources that I personally didn't care about, but we had a client who paid me, and so I had support for it, right? So if there's something I don't support yet and it's really important to you, you can always pay us to make it a priority. Otherwise, put in a ticket and we'll try to get to it. I know, there's some missing things like debugging settings I haven't finished. Some of the error handling pages I haven't completely finished. Scheduled tasks, CFConfig doesn't support those yet. It's all on the roadmap, but it's just a matter of digging down into all those XML files and figuring out where it's all stored. Any other questions? I don't see anybody typing. So where can you find the recording? Dana, all of the recordings are going on the Ortus Solutions website. Here, I'll show you right now. Go to ortussolutions.com. .org. Go to the events menu and click on Container Roadshow 2017. And on this page, we have not only a picture of Gavin's handsome mug, we also have a link to all of the recordings, like Mark Drew's recording and Luis's recording. The link for this recording will be right here, probably later on today. And we also have a link to all of the blog posts. And this is dynamic. It automatically updates every time we post a blog post. So let me put this in the chat, actually. Bookmark that, and that's where all the recordings and all the blog posts are going. Great question. Anybody else? Last call for alcohol or CFConfig Docker related questions. Hopefully, even if you're not doing Docker right now, A&W, yep. Hopefully, if you're not doing Docker right now, CFConfig might still come in handy just for your local development with you and your coworkers. Being able to externalize those settings into a JSON file is actually pretty cool. So, okay, well, thanks, guys. Let's go ahead and kill the recording. I think people can stick around and talk for a few minutes if they want. Go ahead and turn off the share. Actually, I don't know if I can turn off the recording since I'm not the one who started it. Luis, you there? You killed the recording? I don't think I have the ability to stop it. It will be recorded. I'm a slacker because I only talked for 1.25 hours. All right, well, you can go ahead and stop the recording, Luis. Quit being a slacker. Yeah, go ahead and stop it now. I don't see any more questions coming in, so.